he was born a cardinal, crowned himself prince, and declared no man holier than his will. Cesare Borgia, the bastard son of Pope Alexander VI, carved his empire in flesh and fear. But when the Pope died, so did God's protection. What followed was a descent so humiliating, so obscene, that even hell may have flinched. The hour is late in the marble labyrinth of the Apostolic Palace, and yet the 1,000 candles lining its corridors seem unable to banish the pools of shadow that cling to every cornice, as if the darkness itself refuses exile by mere waxlight. In that faltering glow, the 16-year-old Cesare Borgia, illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, glides in scarlet silk that smells faintly of myrrh, old sweat, and newly spilled blood, a scent far more honest than the cassia perfume dabbed beneath his collar to mask it. He pauses before a mirror framed in tarnished gold, studies the cardinalatial mozzetta draped across his shoulders, and feels not the tremor of holy vocation, but the leaden irritation of a wolf forced into a lamb's fleece. Behind the polished glass, his own pupils dilate like ink dropped in water, and for a moment, perhaps only a trick of torchlight, perhaps an omen whispered by devils, he swears the crimson fabric ripples as living muscle, pulsing in rhythm with a heart that desires nothing but conquest. Outside, Rome lies feverish beneath a sky the color of coagulating wine, and within that night the boy cardinal begins the massacre that will define him. A contorted procession of clerks, bankers, and rival prelates lured into side chapels smelling of lilies and candle smoke, then smothered with silken cinctures or served chalices shimmering with cantharides and arsenic. Their corpses, discovered at dawn, gape like ruptured reliquaries, tongues blackened, skin the sickly gray of wax left too close to flame. Whispers skitter through the curia, describing a red-mouthed angel who blesses with one hand and strangles with the other. Yet the pontiff, proud father, negligent shepherd, merely signs indulgences with a hand grown tremulous from indulgence, while deep in the Vatican kitchens the butchers hack fresh haunches for another of his son's midnight banquets, the cleaver's rhythm echoing the thud of hearts that shall soon stop beating. Cesare's rise is not a staircase, but a ladder slick with viscera. In 1593, he strides through central Italy at the head of mercenaries whose boots leave prints shaped like inverted crosses in the spring mud, each occupied city announcing his arrival with a choir of panicked church bells and a smell, instantly recognizable, of burning hair and boiling tallow. Prisoners are hung from battlements by their intestines so that ravens may dine without the inconvenience of flesh tearing. He watches these executions with the flat curiosity of a physician studying gangrene, tilting his head to determine whether the purple mottling of cheeks appears faster in damp coastal air or beneath the dry sirocco sweeping from the Apennines. Afterward, he records the results in a little leather book that once contained psalms. The page is now stained where droplets of other men's lives have soaked through the parchment. Servants who launder his vestments speak, in stifled tones, of an odor clinging to the cardinal's sleeves even after lye and river water, an undertone of spoiled meat, as though decay precedes him like incense before a monstrance. Alchemists blame the Roman fog. Astrologers blame an unlucky conjunction of Mars and Saturn. But old nuns mutter that it is the reek of Cain, proof that heaven itself has marked the youth for damnation. Late at night, that stench thickens in Cesare's private chapel, where a bronze crucifix, its corpus dulled by centuries of veneration, now gleams wet, as if perspiring. Kneeling, he imagines the metal softening beneath his lips, imagines the Savior blinking wearily as nails slide from bone, imagines, worst of all, that the eyes of Christ do not condemn him, because even God is weary of feigning mercy. His dreams grow crowded by carrion birds and shattered halos, and when he wakes, he finds bloody crescents beneath his fingernails where he has clawed his own palms. Physicians prescribe rose syrup and pilgrim relics, yet the tremors only worsen, until during High Mass he spills the chalice and watches consecrated wine run across the altar like arterial spray, pooling around the relic of Saint Sebastian until the bone appears to grin. Congregants gasp. A few cross themselves with desperate ferocity, but the young cardinal merely smiles. A thin, serpentine curve that suggests he alone hears some distant chorus chanting his name in the cadences of apocalypse. By 1597, after the murder of his handsome brother Giovanni, throat carved ear to ear and body cast into the Tiber like refuse. Cesare at last tears the red robes from his shoulders with a gesture half liberation, half molting, and steps into blackened steel armor that fits as if hammered onto his bones at birth. The discarded vestments, sodden with river mist, lie on Vatican marble like the shed skin of a venomous serpent, still twitching in torchlight. Soldiers watching him buckle the cuirass swear that steam rises from the metal where it meets his flesh, as though internal fires demand vent. A chaplain attempts a blessing, but the words spill from his mouth in a stutter and are lost beneath the clamor of hoofbeats as the new prince rides out, scarlet cloak snapping like a banner of plague. Thus, the chapter ends amid thunder rolling across the 7 hills, yet the audience already senses that the true storm brews within Cesare's own body. That unseen rot, whose first sour breath now curls through palace corridors, creeping toward the papal throne and the world beyond, promising that every step of his ascent will drip not with anointing oil, but with slowly clotting blood. It began in silence, as most monstrous things do. In the humid, velvet-sick night of 1597, the golden son of the Borgia family, Giovanni, Duke of Gandia, beloved by courtiers and feared by none, failed to return from a feast. The next morning, a fisherman on the Tiber, wading through garbage and duckweed, found the body. It was floating face down, bloated and pallid, the silks stiff with dried blood and river silt. His throat had been opened so deep it exposed the white cartilage of the windpipe. His mouth was crammed with weeds, packed so tightly they tore the corners of his lips. His eyes were gone, either eaten by fish or taken by someone who feared what they had seen in their final moment. Inside the papal palace, when the news reached Pope Alexander VI, the air turned sharp, not with grief, but with terror. Giovanni had been the favorite. Cesare, standing in the corner of the chamber, said nothing. His gaze never left the body as it was brought in, bare-chested, blue-limbed, the stink of river rot clinging to his golden hair. Some say he smiled. Others say he blinked once and whispered in Latin, "Fiat justitia," let justice be done. Rumors flared like infection. Whispers twisted into shape behind locked doors. It was no robbery, no foreign agent. It was fratricide. It was Cesare, the cardinal who tore off his red robes to become a soldier of nightmares. The Pope, broken but not blind, gave the order. No investigation, no arrests, no punishment. Within the week, Giovanni's quarters were cleared, his possessions burned, his name struck from court calendars. The stain, however, remained. It clung to the marble halls like mildew and death oil, and no incense could lift it. Cesare changed after that, or perhaps he simply unmasked himself fully. The assassinations began quietly. A poisoned host at a cathedral communion, a bishop found with his fingernails pried loose and his tongue nailed to his own Bible. In the countryside, noblemen were discovered flayed alive, their skin draped like banners above their estates. At the gates of Forlì, a man was crucified upside down and set alight. His intestines boiled as he shrieked psalms backward. Witnesses spoke of a tall figure in black armor, watching from horseback, his visor down, unmoving, the sun gleaming off the polished steel like the surface of a sacrificial blade. Some called him the Avenger of Rome. Others said he was no longer a man. His court in Romagna became legend. A palace of red velvet, dark corridors, and mirrors that seemed to hum with heat. Behind its thick curtains, torture became ritual, not punishment. Naked bodies, prisoners, dissenters, even former allies, were suspended by hooks from the ceiling beams. Their screams, wet, animal, high-pitched, echoed against frescoes of saints whose faces had been scratched out by knives. Servants wore slippers so their steps made no noise, only the quiet slap of fabric on blood-slicked tile. They avoided looking into certain rooms, where the air shimmered not from sunlight but from something worse, a spiritual sickness, old and coiled like a serpent in the walls. Doctors summoned to tend prisoners whispered to one another that no wound bled cleanly, that the skin beneath the skin had turned black, and that some of the victims died smiling, as if they had seen a vision before death, something too vast and ancient to name. A nun who came to pray for a dying servant fled screaming when she saw the walls bleeding. She died 2 days later, her body bent backwards, her spine cracked in 3 places, crucifix clenched between her teeth. Through it all, Cesare called it justice. He claimed he was rebuilding order. He invoked law, precedent, divine sanction. But his law was made of fear. His precedent was blood, and his divinity bore no resemblance to Christ. In sermons delivered by trembling priests under armed guard, it was said that God's wrath had become incarnate, and it rode beneath the Borgia banner, crowned not with laurel, but with a noose soaked in bile. The people obeyed. They built statues. They sang hymns. But behind closed doors, mothers fed their children in silence, eyes darting to the shadows. Midwives traced crosses on their stomachs in blood, not oil, to ward off his name. In taverns, men refused to speak above a whisper when recounting how his brother had choked on weeds, as if the devil himself had returned to the river and wore the skin of a cardinal turned king. And yet Cesare showed no fear, only hunger. He dined beneath a ceiling painted with angels, drinking wine the color of old wounds, smiling with lips that still bore the faint green stain of arsenic from his personal tasting rituals. Each night, as he undressed, he would pause before the mirror, not to admire himself, but to check for decay, not on his skin, on his soul. He found none, which, perhaps, was the final confirmation that something holy had already died inside him, and that what remained was a vessel for justice, sharpened, blood-soaked, and bound for ruin. In the heart of Urbino, nestled beneath a sky the color of bruised flesh and low thunder, stood a palace too quiet for its size. Behind its carved walnut doors and damask-draped corridors, a single room had gone still, not from neglect, but from dread. It was a grand chamber with vaulted ceilings, floor-to-ceiling tapestries, and a single dominating centerpiece, a portrait of Cesare Borgia, stretching nearly from the marble floor to the golden ribs of the ceiling, painted in oils so rich and dark they seemed to never fully dry. The frame, carved from cypress wood, fire-gilded and engraved with Latin scripture, was older than the painting itself, rumored to have once hung in a chapel desecrated by fire and sealed by monks. But it was the canvas that commanded terror. Cesare, immortalized in full armor, stood against a storm-lit battlefield, his right gauntlet gripping the hilt of his sword, his left hand raised, not in benediction, but judgment. The artist had been paid a sum greater than a bishop's ransom and had worked in silence, weeks without sunlight, often refusing food, muttering prayers beneath his breath as if painting not a man but something that might awaken. When he finally presented the work, he refused to sign it. That same night, he disappeared from the palace and was found, days later, barefoot and blind, clawing at his own eyes in a chapel north of Rimini, whispering that the mouth moved when I touched the lips. At first, Cesare was pleased. He would dine in the chamber, alone sometimes, admiring his own likeness by torchlight. He ordered the room perfumed with amber and musk, and instructed servants to burn cedar at midnight, so the scent would cling to the painted robes like incense clings to holy vestments. But it was not long before the whispers began. A maid, young and devout, swore the painting's eyes followed her, that as she passed with a silver tray, she felt her lungs constrict, as though her breath had been measured and found wanting. Another claimed that when the torches flickered, blood glistened on the corner of Cesare's lips, dark and viscous, pooling on the floor in a puddle that evaporated before she returned with others. One chamberlain vomited on the floor and collapsed when he heard, faint but distinct, a voice murmur from the canvas, "I am the law." Cesare laughed when told. At first, he walked into the room alone, stared into his own painted face for over an hour, and emerged calm. "Let the cowards fear the face of justice," he said. But after that, he no longer dined there. The room was locked. Only one key remained, worn beneath Cesare's own tunic. Yet at night, some claimed the door creaked open on its own. Guards posted outside swore they saw red light spill beneath the threshold, like the glow of coals beneath a confessional floor. One heard muffled groaning, as though someone or something was trapped inside, clawing not to escape, but to be seen. It was in these same weeks that his body began to betray him. The first sign came with a sore, small, at the edge of his jawline, beneath the shadow of his beard. A physician lanced it, but more followed. Boils that refused to close, crusting with pus, then splitting again. His breath turned sour, then fetid, thick as rotting meat held beneath the tongue. He woke at night choking, clutching at his throat, convinced something small and winged was nesting in his mouth. Soon after, his jaw began to swell, subtly at first, a tightness, a stiffness, then a bulge, like a fist pressing out from beneath the skin. His physicians, trembling, diagnosed it as a fever of unknown origin, but the truth came from an old Dominican monk, brought in to exorcise a chapel. The monk refused to even approach Cesare, declaring in Latin, "This is the mark of the whore's disease, a prince cursed by his own appetite." Syphilis. Within weeks, his teeth loosened. One fell out during council. It dropped into his goblet with a soft clink, startling a scribe into dropping his quill. His gums blackened, and open sores bloomed beneath his beard, leaking yellow fluid that stained his collars and soaked into the lace. He began to wear masks during appearances, first of velvet, then of beaten gold, but they could not hide the stench, that rotting sweetness that clung to him like a miasma. His servants burned his linens nightly. Blood, pus, and bile soaked every sheet. On one occasion, they found a live maggot curled in the fold of his pillow. It had crawled from a wound behind his ear. Cesare, when shown, laughed again, a sound like glass grinding in a leather pouch, and said, "Even carrion beasts know greatness." But in private, he stopped looking at mirrors, and he never opened the portrait room again. Some said that as his health declined, the painting changed, that the flesh on the canvas face began to sag, that a black sore appeared beneath the chin, just where the real one festered, that the lips cracked and the gold of the frame began to tarnish, as if the rot had spread into the wood. One servant, before vanishing, claimed he had seen worms writhing within the painted eyes. By the end of that year, no one spoke of the portrait. The room was bricked over, the frame entombed behind plaster, but sometimes, in the right corridor, on cold nights when the oil lamps dim and the stone walls seem to exhale, one can still hear it, a voice, soft, splintered. "I am the law," and the man who once believed it, now rotting, not in a crypt, but from the inside out, teeth gone, face bloated, a God-made flesh now collapsing under the weight of his own divine delusion. The judgment he spoke of had arrived, but it wore his own face. It began with a banquet. August in Rome was thick with flies and fever, the air barely moving between the sun-bleached walls of the Vatican palaces, where sweat pooled beneath vestments and the smell of jasmine could not mask the stink of sewage, spoiled meat, and old death. The year was 1503, and in the Apostolic Palace, under candlelight dimmed by heat haze and yellow smoke, Pope Alexander VI, once Rodrigo Borgia, now the father of Christendom, raised his goblet in triumph. The wine, dark and clotted with floating herbs, glistened like congealed blood. At his side sat his son, Cesare, waxen beneath layers of scented oils, his face still marred by sores hidden poorly beneath perfumed gauze and golden cloth. They drank together, father and son, one hand on the chalice, the other on power, until the hand of God, or something older, struck. The Pope collapsed first, his lips purpled mid-laughter, his body pitching forward, knocking over a dish of roasted quail, the bones clattering like dice across the table. Gasps turned to screams. He convulsed on the marble floor, bile and half-digested figs pouring from his mouth, the veins in his neck bulging until one ruptured, spraying blood against the hem of a cardinal's robe. His final breath, some claimed, sounded like a gargled prayer, but others said it was only a grunt, the kind a dying animal makes when it finally feels the knife go in. Cesare stood, unmoving. A faint smile curved the corner of his mouth, either pride or relief or something darker. Some said he had meant to kill another, that the poison had taken the wrong path. Others whispered that no poison was needed, that the devil had come to reclaim his own son and took the father first. But 3 days later, Cesare collapsed too. It began with the cold, not outside, but within him, a chill spreading from the base of his spine like a leaking draft through rotted stone. climbing vertebra by vertebra until his teeth began to chatter and his fingertips turned the color of old bruises. Then came the fever, a heat so intense he screamed as they poured cool water over him, clawing at his own tunic as if trying to tear his skin off. He sweated blood. His gums bled in his sleep. The whites of his eyes turned the color of rancid fat, yellow and slick, and his pupils narrowed into pinholes like a corpse laid too long in the sun. They moved him to a side chamber, away from the throne, the relics, the sacred spaces. There, beneath a crucifix that would not stay upright, he descended into a week-long hell. The bed was soaked within hours, not from sweat alone, but from the black sludge that seeped from the wounds on his back and the sores in his groin. The stench was unspeakable. Iron, rot, something animal. Flies gathered in clusters around his lips, drawn to the sweet tang of his breath, which now reeked of decaying fruit and pus. Physicians came and went, their faces covered, hands trembling, whispering of the black bile, of corruption, of judgment. One priest, sent to bless him, refused to enter the room. Another vomited and fainted. By the fourth day, Cesare had begun to speak in tongues, not Latin, not Italian, but some broken guttural chant, as if his mouth had been hijacked by something ancient and buried. He laughed and wept in the same breath. He screamed for Giovanni, his dead brother, swearing he saw him hanging from the beams above the bed, eyes hollow, lips sewn shut. He begged for fire. Then, moments later, shrieked that fire was consuming him from the inside, that serpents had taken root in his belly and were feasting on his spine. He voided himself in the sheets, blood and black water and chunks of necrotic flesh pooling beneath him. His skin began to peel, first at the elbows, then the thighs, exposing pale, weeping layers of raw tissue, which clung to the linens and tore anew with every shift of his body. And still, no cardinals came. The papacy had turned its back. The same men who had once bowed before him now walked with heads down, crossing themselves as they passed his chamber door. No one prayed for him, no relics were brought, no incense burned. He was alone, with his rotting flesh, his visions, and the God he had once tried to replace. A servant, a mute boy no older than 12, was the only one who remained. He wiped Cesare's cracked lips with a cloth soaked in vinegar, changed his dressings, poured water into his mouth drop by drop, and even he refused to meet Cesare's eyes. By the end of the second week, Cesare could no longer speak. His tongue had swollen, purple and blistered, filling his mouth like a parasite. His breath came in rattles. His eyes no longer closed. They simply rolled back into his skull, exposing only white. His body had wasted to bone and blister, a prince reduced to a leaking sack of meat, a vessel too broken to contain whatever madness still flickered behind his ruined gaze. Some said he died, others said he survived, but all agreed he had been unmade. When Cesare finally rose from his sickbed, days or weeks later, no one counted, he did not emerge restored. He limped, hunched, as if the illness had bent not just his bones, but his soul. His once glorious jaw was pitted and sunken, his teeth half gone, his breath so foul servants fainted from it. He spoke less, his gaze wandered. He avoided churches, avoided mirrors, avoided the sound of bells. He did not bury his father. He burned his own linens, burned his bed, burned the crucifix that refused to stay upright. He ordered the chamber sealed, the walls repainted. But even beneath the new plaster, servants claimed they could still smell it, the blood, the bile, the stench of divine punishment. In the year 1503, the Pope died, and with him, the illusion that Cesare Borgia was touched by God. What remained was only a man, ravaged, hollowed, left behind by heaven, and already followed by something far darker. By the winter of 1507, Cesare Borgia was no longer a prince, nor a cardinal, nor a man seated at the right hand of a pope. He was a mercenary in exile, reduced to issuing orders in a borrowed tongue, wearing rusted chainmail that pinched his sores and smelled of other men's deaths. His name, once spoken in whispers of awe and dread from Milan to Naples, had become a footnote passed between bored captains and indifferent kings. Rome had spat him out. Florence had forgotten him. Even the Vatican, where once his blood stained the marble altar steps, refused to acknowledge he had ever been born. He was 31 years old, and he was rotting from the inside. His skin, pocked and sun-scorched, stretched too tightly across his bones, and where once there had been sinew, now there was only a fevered tremor. His gums bled nightly, staining the linens with thin rust-colored circles that no washerwoman could clean. The stench that clung to him, an acidic blend of old pus, horse sweat, and suppurating wounds, grew so unbearable that even hardened soldiers refused to share a tent with him. When he rode, he tied rags soaked in myrrh beneath his arms and crushed rosemary into his gloves. But the decay had already worked its way into the seams of his body, an odor not of man, but of something already half devoured. And yet, he still believed he could win. At the siege of Viana, deep in the frost-bitten hills of Navarre, Cesare made his final mistake. He pursued a retreating enemy commander into a narrow mountain pass, ignoring the warnings of his lieutenants, riding ahead of his own men, as if his presence alone could command victory. It was raining, not a downpour, but a steady, bone-chilling drizzle that turned the rocks to grease and the trail into a ribbon of gray-brown slime that sucked at hooves and boots alike. He wore no helmet. His breastplate was undone. His sword arm trembled beneath the weight of his own weapon. They were waiting for him. He saw them only when it was far too late. 6 men in rusted cuirasses, half-masked, their insignias obscured, faces familiar from years past. He recognized at least 2. Former allies, once kneeling before him, now standing in the rain like butchers before a carcass. No words were spoken, only steel. The first blade struck him low, sliding beneath his guard, tearing through the meat of his thigh, slicing tendon and nerve. He fell from the horse without grace, a hard, wet thud onto the rocks, the air driven from his lungs like smoke from a snuffed candle. Before he could scream, another blade found his abdomen, and another, short, brutal thrusts, angled upward into the gut, designed not to kill quickly, but to let the body know it was dying. He pissed himself in the mud. He clawed at the stones, trying to rise, but his hand slipped on his own entrails, which had begun to spill from the gaping wound in his belly. Wet loops of intestine, pale and pulsing, slicked in crimson and bile. One of the men laughed, not cruelly, but absently, as if startled by the absurdity of it. They did not finish him cleanly. They tore away his armor, piece by piece, as though flaying a beast, and when they reached his tunic, they stripped that too, leaving him naked and curled in the wet gravel like a worm caught in a spade's bite. He tried to speak. No words came, only a choking rattle, and then a string of yellow spit, heavy with blood, that slid from his cracked lips and vanished into the mud. They left him there, unburied, unblessed, unclothed. The rain fell harder in the night, washing away the tracks, but not the body. By morning, local peasants found him, bloated, twisted, his face unrecognizable, either from the blows or from the onset of decomposition. One woman fainted. Another dropped to her knees and crossed herself, murmuring that the corpse bore the mark of Cain, that Satan had come to collect his debt. They did not call a priest. They did not touch the body. One man, a half-blind shepherd, said he saw steam rise from the wounds, though the air was cold. Another claimed he saw the eyes open just for a moment and blink. The only attempt at burial was a shallow pit dug with broken tools behind the chapel wall, not within the sanctified ground, but just beyond it, where dogs sometimes pissed and children dared each other to sleep on All Souls' Eve. His corpse was rolled into it like meat, unwashed, unsheeted, and covered hastily with damp soil and wet leaves. No headstone, no cross, and when the rains came again, just days later, the earth shifted. The body surfaced. They say crows gathered, and they did not scatter when the townspeople passed. This was not a martyr's end, not the death of a hero or a prince or even a criminal. This was the end reserved for monsters, butchered, abandoned, and buried without name, without dignity, without even a prayer to drown the silence. The man who once believed himself to be the hand of divine justice, who sat above kings and whispered death like scripture, died alone, stripped and gutted in the mud. and the world moved on. There was no bell. When Cesare Borgia died in the mud behind the hills of Viana, torn open and naked, there were no tolling chimes, no weeping priests, no public mourning. Only silence, thick, damp, and indifferent. His body, bloated from the night rains and already ruptured by carrion beaks, was dragged not in reverence but in revulsion, wrapped in a discarded ox hide, its edges stiff with dried manure. He was no longer feared. He was no longer remembered. He was eat, and meat does not require a requiem. They would not bury him in the church. The local friars, ancient men with cracked knuckles and prayer ropes worn to threads, stood at the chapel door and shook their heads, lips drawn tight in scorn, fingers twitching in silent exorcisms. One whispered that the devil takes back his own, and another pointed at the festering wound that had split Cesare's abdomen and said that no soul remained to sanctify. The bishop sent from Pamplona refused to sign the burial writ. The holy ground, sacred, consecrated, reserved for the forgiven, would not be polluted by a prince who had lived as a god and died as an animal. So they buried him just outside the wall, beneath a patch of scorched grass and thorny brambles where even the ground seemed reluctant to yield. The grave was shallow, the soil loose, the stones unblessed. A carpenter's apprentice nailed together a crude wooden marker. It had no name, only the word maledictus scratched into its grain with a rusted nail. The cursed one. Locals would not speak of it. For months, they avoided the spot. Children were warned to stay away. Shepherds rerouted their herds. The bramble grew thicker, darker, as if fed by something beneath. Stories began to swell in the mouths of those who passed too close. Tales of whispers in the night, of cold wind without breeze, of a voice speaking Latin backwards from under the stones. A woman miscarried near the grave. A blind dog fell ill and would not stop barking until it chewed through its own paw. One priest hanged himself in the chapel. His note, found beneath a broken crucifix, read only, "He is not gone." Then came the exhumation. No one claimed responsibility. Some said it was children playing at saints and sinners, digging in the weeds with sticks until the earth split open and the bones emerged like relics from a poisoned reliquary. Others said it was the church itself, seeking to erase even the memory of his resting place, casting the remains into a dry riverbed or a lime pit, so that not even the dust could find peace. What is certain is this: his body did not stay buried. Fragments were found in strange places. A tooth, blackened and split, lodged in the hollow of a tree. A length of femur gnawed by dogs. A rib bone laid neatly on the altar steps one morning, still crusted with soil. No one took them away. No one touched them. The marker vanished. The bramble grew over the grave, thorns twisting into shapes some swore looked like hands, grasping, clawing, reaching upward. Rain would not fall there. Flowers planted in the soil withered by sunrise. Even the moss refused to spread. Today, nothing marks the spot. Tourists walk past, farmers let their animals graze, but none linger. Something, unnamed, unspoken, hangs in the air like the final note of a condemned man's scream, the part that echoes after the rope tightens. No inscription bears his name. No statue honors his reign. No stone carries his memory. And yet, he is not forgotten, not as a ruler, not as a martyr, not as a son, but as a warning, a tale told by firelight, a curse muttered through rosary teeth, a prince who sought to be God, and in doing so was stripped of even the right to be human, unmade by time, unburied by the living, and left to wander as an echo of ambition punished by divine silence. This is his legacy, not a tomb, but emptiness.